What I'm trying to do really is to think about not just contesting homophobias, but to contest heteronormativity, to think that while we have that notion in any way of the normative and the non-normative, our understandings of sexual attachments, desires, living, is somehow always going to be embattled, and questions of margins, etc., and inside outside will exist. So, and really, I guess one of the statements that was very important to me was reading through Thomas Glave's landmark anthology, Our Caribbean, and there's a letter in there from Helen Clanaris. It was part of an open letter that she issued to a Bahamian pastor after he'd led 3 anti-gay demonstrations, and this letter that appears in the Nassau Daily Tribune says, "I don't want to be accommodated, I want to be embraced." And I guess one of the things that I think literature can do is to be very effective on that idea of affective accommodation, of thinking kind of, as interior subjects, what lives are possible. It can kind of render the insides of human beings without necessarily having to categorize them. So I guess what I'm trying to do in the work that I'm doing at the moment, which is a book project, is I've already written quite a lot about writing that kind of identifies and knows itself to be LGBT. What I'm interested in now really is looking at writing that wouldn't be read within that paradigm, and trying to see whether there is a whole kind of repertoire of desire and attachment that we might want to see as disrupting heteronormativity. So I guess what strikes me as someone who's not just worked in sexuality studies but's worked on Caribbean literature for a long time, is that what's so celebrated about Caribbean literature is the idea that because of terrible, violent historical ruptures and forced movements of populations and a kind of catastrophic past, in the present, normativities really have been transformed, liquidity, fluidity, creolization. So there's this whole model of the Caribbean as a cultural phenomena that endorses a kind of non-normativities. And yet you get to sexuality and there's suddenly this massive conceptual anomaly that in terms of sexuality there are normativities. And it seems to me that the writing, that going back through literature, actually what we see is that the kind of liquid, fluid, plastic is actually there too. And so the book's an attempt to kind of try and talk about that, to talk about it in lots of different contexts. So, something from, Naipaul's writings, which I think is not just in that one little figure, but in Enigma of Arrival as well. It's very strongly there. I think that kind of identification with Walcott's, pantomime, the whole kind of way in which it both rehearses and mimics, but also actually stages kind of male-male intimacy. Some of his poems in The Bounty, even reading Junot Díaz's A Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is seen to be a book all about hypermasculinity. In fact, I think it's a book about a man who dreams about another man years after he's dead, and the kind of yearning that's expressed for him is really kind of extraordinary, and the kind of fragility that it shows to this performance that has to be constantly reiterated because it is so fragile. So I guess that's the kind of project I'm interested in thinking about, is thinking that that there might be these descriptions and representations of sexuality that disorganize categories, that allow for a much more kind of plural and pliant and supple idea about sexual life and sexual desires. And I guess that sometimes that also has an interesting correlation with what's going on, and I'm just going to end by saying very briefly that I'd been working on Andrew Solke's novel called Escape to an Autumn Pavement. I don't know how many of you know that. And it was published in 1960. It's a very interesting, very strange and interesting book. and it talks about a Jamaican man who comes over to Britain and forms an attachment. He is kind of escaping what he sees as a fake middle class. And he forms an attachment with both a man and a woman. And they both want to identify him in their world. So the British man wants him to come out as a homosexual and leaves him a letter saying, you know, you have to become a homosexual. And the woman says, look, you've got me pregnant. You know, in other words, she wants him in her world script. So they're both trying to world build around him. But at the same time, he just says, no, all of you are just trying, you don't understand my freedoms, is what he actually says, which is a really interesting statement, I think. And I think that it's very interesting that he's writing that book at that time, because this was during the period that the Wolfenden inquiry was going on in England. And although the Wolfenden inquiry is often known for its recommendation, which was that consenting sex between adults in private should be decriminalised, which seems like a very positive outcome. It also did that on the basis of a highly elitist testimony, so that men who had access to private places were fine, but those who didn't, and this whole construction of the respectable homosexual. So I think Salk is both balancing this particular kind of Caribbean notion of not wanting to be categorized as a one sort of freedom, but also this need to actually do away with our kind of homonormativity. And it's just struck me recently that I've been reading some of the stuff in the Jamaican newspapers, and Kai Miller wrote a blog piece talking about this kind of almost exactly the same thing happening in Jamaica, where there is this categorization of the respectable homosexual and then those who fall outside of that, and the way in which that, you know, what the perils are in a way of a kind of homonormativity in those discourses. So that's just to say that I think literature speaks to life in all kinds of ways, and that's one of the ways in which I've been trying to think about that conversation. Okay.